The heat came first, then the silence. Marshal Thaddeus Crane felt both as his horse crested the final rise before Whitmore Parish, the August sun pressing down on South Carolina like a hand covering a mouth. Beside him, Judge Cornelius Ashford pulled a handkerchief across his neck, the linen already dark with sweat though it was barely past 9 in the morning. Neither man spoke. The telegram that had summoned them from Charleston 3 days prior sat folded in Crane's vest pocket, the paper soft from repeated readings. Come immediately, stop something wrong, stop all dead, stop Mercer. Sheriff Gideon Mercer had served Whitmore Parish for 16 years. He was not a man given to hysteria or brevity. The telegram's sparse panic had pulled Crane from his bed at dawn, and now, as they approached the white-painted gates that marked the parish entrance, he understood why no follow-up message had arrived. Mercer stood in the middle of the road. He had been standing there, Crane would later learn, for nearly 11 hours. His uniform was drenched through, his face burned the deep red of a man who had forgotten the sun existed. But it was his eyes that stopped Crane's hand from raising in greeting. They were fixed on something beyond the gates, wide and unblinking, seeing everything and comprehending nothing. Gideon, Crane called, dismounting. His boots hit the packed earth with a sound that seemed too loud, as if the world itself had turned down its volume and any noise was an intrusion. Gideon, what's happened here? The sheriff's lips moved. No sound emerged at first, then a whisper so faint Crane had to step closer to hear, gone. All gone. But they're still here. Do you understand? They're still here but they're gone. Judge Ashford exchanged a glance with Crane, his weathered face folding into deeper creases of concern. Who's gone, Sheriff? Speak plainly, man. Everyone. Mercer's voice cracked on the word. No. Not everyone. Just, you have to see. I can't, I don't have words for what's in there. Crane placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder, felt the man trembling despite the oppressive heat. Stay here. We'll look. Don't touch them, Mercer said suddenly, his eyes finally breaking from their fixed stare to meet Crane's. Promise me you won't touch them. Their skin is wrong. Everything is wrong. The gates to Whitmore Parish stood open. As Crane and Ashford passed through, the change was immediate and undeniable. The air became still, not calm, but arrested, as if the atmosphere itself had been caught mid-breath and forgotten how to exhale. Crane's horse nickered nervously, tossing its head. When he tried to lead it forward, the animal planted its hooves and refused to move. Ashford's mount did the same. We walk, Crane said, though he felt the same reluctance thrumming through his own chest. The main street of Whitmore Parish stretched before them, lined with prosperous houses painted white and yellow, their porches decorated with hanging baskets that had once held flowers. Crane noticed the flowers had all died, though not from the heat, they had simply stopped living, their petals still attached but colorless, drained of vitality. Then he saw the first body. Josiah Whitmore, the patriarch whose family had established this parish 60 years prior, sat in his rocking chair on his front porch. His newspaper lay open across his lap, reading spectacles still perched on his nose. His mouth was slightly open, as if he had been about to call out to someone. He had been dead for at least a day, the beginning of decomposition showed in the slight discoloration of his skin, the gathering of flies at his eyes and mouth, but he sat peacefully, as if death had been nothing more than falling asleep in his favorite chair. Ashford approached slowly, removing his hat. Dear God. But God, it seemed, had not been present in Whitmore Parish when Josiah Whitmore died. They found Margaret Hensley in her garden, kneeling among her tomato plants with a basket beside her half filled with green fruit. Her hands were still positioned as if reaching for the next tomato, her face tilted up toward the sun she would never feel again. 3 houses down, the Brennan family, mother, father, and 4 children, sat around their breakfast table, plates still full of food that had gone to rot, flies now feasting where the family never would again. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 5, had a spoonful of porridge halfway to her mouth. With each discovery, the horror compounded not through violence but through its complete absence. There were no signs of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken windows, no screams frozen on dead faces. Whitmore Parish's residents had simply stopped living, as if some vast hand had reached down and extinguished their lives with the casual ease of snuffing candles. Thaddeus. Judge Ashford's voice carried from the town's small square, where a Confederate flag hung limp in the airless morning. You need to see this. Crane found him standing before the parish church, its white steeple piercing the colorless sky. The doors stood open. Inside, the entire congregation sat in their pews, 47 souls, Crane would count later, dressed in their Sunday finest though this was a Tuesday. They faced the pulpit where Reverend Thomas Gaines stood with his Bible open, one hand raised in mid-sermon, dead on his feet like some grotesque statue commemorating devotion. They came to church, Ashford whispered. In the middle of the night, by the look of it. Came to church and died in their pews. Crane moved down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing obscenely in the sacred silence. The faces of the dead were serene, some even bore slight smiles, as if they had heard something beautiful in their final moments. He reached the front pew and stopped. Catherine Marsh sat with her hands folded in her lap, a teacup still balanced perfectly in her right hand. The porcelain was fine china, delicate as a bird bone, painted with small blue flowers. Tea had been in that cup once, Crane could see the brown stain at the bottom, but Catherine Marsh had died before she could drink it, died sitting in church at what must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, holding her teacup with the gentle grace of a woman at a social gathering. This isn't possible, Ashford breathed. Mass poisoning, perhaps, but then where's the agony? Where's the convulsions, though? There's more. Crane's voice came out rougher than he intended. Come. They emerged from the church into that terrible, pressing silence and moved toward the eastern edge of the parish, where a cluster of smaller structures marked the boundary between prosperity and bondage. The slave quarters of Whitmore Parish had housed, according to tax records, approximately 237 enslaved souls. The quarters stood empty. Every door hung open. Inside the cramped buildings, Crane found pallets made of corn husks, crude blankets folded with care, a few meager possessions arranged on shelves fashioned from scrap wood. But no people. Not a single person. In the yard between the quarters, iron shackles lay in the dust, their locks open, the chains arranged in a pattern Crane couldn't immediately comprehend. He knelt beside them, running his fingers over the metal still warm from lying in the sun. These hadn't been broken or forced, they had been unlocked, methodically, and then placed here with deliberate precision. The other plantations, Ashford said suddenly. We need to check the other plantations within the parish boundaries. They found the same scene repeated across Whitmore Parish's 4 major plantations and 6 smaller holdings. At Thornhill, Crane counted 63 white bodies and found 89 empty slave dwellings. At Riverside, 41 dead whites and 63 vanished enslaved. At Mercy's End, a name that now seemed prophetic, 78 dead, 112 gone. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they had the numbers, 402 white residents of Whitmore Parish, dead in positions of perfect peace. 847 enslaved people vanished without a trace. The mathematics of it made Crane's skin crawl. He stood in what had been the overseer's house at the Whitmore family's main plantation, the largest holding in the parish. The overseer, a man named Calhoun, by the ledgers Crane found, sat dead in his chair, a glass of whiskey still in his hand. The house was furnished with the modest comfort afforded to a man trusted with managing human property, a rayal bed, a wooden table, glass windows that caught the afternoon light. Crane searched methodically, overturning papers, checking drawers, looking for anything that might explain the inexplicable. It was beneath the porch, in the crawlspace where the foundation met the earth, that he found it. The symbol had been scratched into the wood with something sharp, a nail, perhaps, or a piece of broken glass. It was circular, roughly the size of a man's palm, composed of interlocking curves that created the impression of movement even in stillness. Within the circle, smaller symbols repeated, marks that might have been letters in some language Crane didn't recognize, or perhaps pictographs representing concepts beyond his comprehension. He had served as a federal marshal for 12 years, had traveled from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, had seen native markings and African symbols and the secret signs of various fraternal organizations. This matched none of them. Yet despite its strangeness, something about the symbol struck Crane as ancient, as if the pattern itself existed before anyone had ever carved it into wood, waiting in some eternal darkness for hands to reproduce its shape in the material world. He traced the grooves with his finger. The wood felt colder than it should have in the August heat. "Judge," he called, his voice swallowed by that oppressive silence the moment it left his mouth. He had to call 3 more times before Ashford heard and came. The old judge knelt beside him in the dirt, his knees popping in protest. He studied the symbol for a long moment, his face growing paler. "I've seen something like this," he said finally. "In Haiti, before the revolution. I was a young man, part of a trade delegation. We stayed at a plantation outside Port-au-Prince." He paused, licked his lips. The enslaved there had symbols carved into their sleeping quarters. The plantation owner laughed about it, calling it superstition, primitive religion. 3 weeks after we left, every white person on that plantation was dead. The enslaved vanished into the mountains, and when the French military went to find them, he trailed off. "What?" Crane pressed. "They found altars in the high caves. Symbols like this one, painted in blood and ash. And they heard singing that came from everywhere and nowhere, sung in voices that didn't sound human anymore." Ashford's hands were shaking. "The soldiers who went into those caves, some came back changed. They wouldn't speak of what they'd seen. Within a year, the entire colony was in flames." Crane looked back at the symbol, at the deliberate care with which it had been carved in a place where it wouldn't be easily discovered. He thought of the empty quarters, the open shackles, the 402 dead whose hearts had simply stopped beating in the same terrible instant. "How many of these do you think we'll find?" Ashford asked quietly. They searched as the afternoon bled into evening, and the answer became clear: hundreds. Beneath every porch, inside every slave quarter, carved into floorboards in houses where no enslaved person should have had access, scratched into the wooden beams of barns and storage sheds, the symbol repeated, always hidden, always deliberate, a pattern of marking that must have taken years to complete. As dusk gathered over Whitmore Parish, Crane stood at its center, surrounded by the geometry of death and disappearance. The bodies would need to be buried, though he dreaded touching them despite Mercer's warning. The investigation would need to expand, search parties organized, explanations manufactured for authorities in Charleston who would demand accountability, punishment, closure. But Marshal Thaddeus Crane knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like winter cold, that no explanation would suffice. No search party would find the vanished. And the only closure Whitmore Parish would ever receive was the closure of dirt shoveled over mass graves, and the eventual abandonment of this cursed ground to the patient wilderness that had existed before white men carved their plantations from it. Behind him, Judge Ashford stood in the gathering darkness, and Crane heard him whisper a question to no one: what if they deserved it? The silence of Whitmore Parish offered no answer, but in that silence, Crane thought he heard something else, distant, sourceless, more feeling than sound, the ghost of voices raised in harmony, singing of deliverance. If you're enjoying this descent into darkness, subscribe for more macabre tales from America's hidden history. Drop a comment below: do you believe in supernatural retribution? Dr. Emmett Hawthorne arrived at Whitmore Parish just after dawn on the second day, accompanied by Reverend Isaiah Blackwell. Both men had traveled through the night from Belmont, summoned by a rider Crane had dispatched with urgent instructions: bring a physician and a man of God, and bring them quickly. Hawthorne was a practical man, educated at the University of Pennsylvania, who had served as an army surgeon before establishing his practice in Belmont. He had seen death in quantities that would break lesser men: cholera outbreaks, yellow fever, the aftermath of industrial accidents where bodies had to be identified by their clothing rather than their faces. He prided himself on clinical detachment, on the ability to see a corpse as a medical puzzle rather than a former person. That detachment lasted approximately 30 seconds after entering Whitmore Parish. "Sweet Christ," he breathed, his medical bag slipping from nerveless fingers to hit the ground with a thud that seemed to echo forever in the unnatural quiet. Reverend Blackwell, by contrast, said nothing. He simply removed his hat, clutched his Bible to his chest, and began to pray in a whisper that grew more frantic with each passing moment. Crane had organized the work with grim efficiency. The bodies needed to be examined, catalogued, and, eventually, buried. The August heat was accelerating decomposition, and already the sweet sick smell of death had begun to permeate the parish. He had convinced Sheriff Mercer to ride to neighboring holdings and recruit men willing to assist, though many had refused once they heard the basic facts. Those who came did so armed, their hands never far from their pistols, as if death itself might be contagious. "I need you to examine them," Crane told Hawthorne. "All of them. I need to know how they died." "All of them?" Hawthorne's voice climbed. "Marshal, there must be 402, Judge Ashford supplied quietly. "We've counted 4 times to be certain." Hawthorne stared at the number as if it were written in a foreign language. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself, retrieved his medical bag, and nodded. I'll start with the most recent. Show me. They began with the Whitmore family's main house. The patriarch, Josiah, still sat on his porch, though his body had stiffened in the heat. Hawthorne examined him with quick, professional movements, checking the eyes, the mouth, palpating the neck and chest, studying the discoloration of the skin. No signs of trauma, he muttered, more to himself than to his audience. No petechiae in the eyes to suggest strangulation or suffocation. Lividity is consistent with the position of death, he died sitting here. He pulled down the man's collar, examined the neck more closely. No injection marks, no signs of poison around the mouth or nose. He paused, frowning. His expression is peaceful. Whatever killed him, it wasn't painful. Can you determine the cause? Crane asked. Not without a full autopsy, and even then. Hawthorne shook his head. Marshal, in my experience, when the heart simply stops without trauma or disease, we're looking at something beyond current medical understanding. A stroke, perhaps, or some form of syncope, but to affect 400 people simultaneously. He laughed, a sound without humor. That's not medicine. That's something else entirely. They moved through the parish in systematic fashion. Hawthorne examined dozens of bodies, men, women, children of all ages. Each examination yielded the same results: no trauma, no obvious cause of death, expressions of peace or mild surprise frozen on faces that would never move again. By midday, the doctor's hands had begun to shake. They're all the same, he said, sitting heavily on the steps of the general store where the proprietor lay dead behind his counter, coins still scattered on the wood where he'd been counting them. Every single one. It's as if someone reached inside their chests and simply stopped their hearts. All at once. No pain, no struggle, just cessation. Reverend Blackwell had been conducting his own investigation, moving through the parish with increasing agitation. He had examined the church, the houses, the various buildings that made up Whitmore Parish's infrastructure. Now he approached Crane and the others with a face gone pale as August cotton. The church, he said. There's something you need to see in the church. They followed him back to the white-steepled building where the congregation sat eternally in their pews. Blackwell led them past the dead parishioners to the pulpit, where Reverend Gaines stood with his Bible open. The Reverend's fingers still touched the page where he'd been reading, and Blackwell carefully turned the book to show them. The text had been altered. Someone had taken pen and ink and rewritten the verses, transforming scripture into something altogether different. Where the King James text should have read of mercy and forgiveness, new words proclaimed judgment and retribution. Crane leaned closer, reading. And the oppressor shall know the patient fury of the oppressed. And in the hour of reckoning, the chains shall open and the captive shall walk free. And those who profited from suffering shall know suffering eternal, and their hearts shall stop as one, and their names shall be forgotten by the righteous. That's not scripture, Ashford whispered. No, Blackwell agreed. It's not. But look at the handwriting. Crane studied the alterations more closely. The ink was relatively fresh, applied within the last few weeks, he judged, but the handwriting changed throughout. Some letters were carefully formed, as if by someone newly taught to write. Others were crude, the work of hands more accustomed to labor than literacy. Still others showed a practiced elegance that spoke of education. Different hands, Crane said. Many different hands. I found more in the hymnals, Blackwell continued, moving to the pews. He picked up one of the books and opened it. Every hymn had been similarly altered, the familiar verses of devotion transformed into promises of deliverance, of freedom, of reversal of fortune. They've all been changed. Every single book in this church. When? Ashford demanded. When could they have done this? These people attended services every Sunday. Surely someone would have noticed. Would they? Blackwell's voice carried an edge that surprised Crane. When was the last time a white congregation truly looked at what their enslaved servants were doing? When they opened these books to sing, did they see the words or just mouth familiar sounds from memory? He set the hymnal down with exaggerated care. The invisible did this. The people no one saw even when they looked directly at them. Hawthorne was flipping through other hymnals, his face growing more disturbed with each page. This would have taken months. Maybe years. The planning, the coordination, he stopped abruptly. There's more. In the rectory. I saw papers, documents. I thought they were just church records, but now. The rectory adjoined the church, a modest building that served as Reverend Gaines's living quarters and office. They found it in disarray, drawers pulled open, papers scattered, a chair overturned. Someone had searched this room, though whether before or after the deaths, Crane couldn't determine. Blackwell went directly to the floorboards near the small fireplace. He knelt, running his hands over the wood until he found what he sought, a loose board that lifted easily to reveal a space beneath. Inside lay a collection of journals, perhaps a dozen in total, their covers worn from handling. Blackwell pulled one out and opened it. The pages were covered in writing, but not in any language Crane immediately recognized. Symbols, letters that might have been from various African languages or perhaps invented entirely, numbers and diagrams that suggested careful record-keeping. "It's encoded," Ashford said, looking over Blackwell's shoulder. "Some kind of cipher." "Not just one cipher," the Reverend corrected. "Look, the patterns change every few pages. Multiple codes, multiple contributors." He pointed to certain recurring symbols. "But these repeat. Names, perhaps. Or places." Crane took one of the journals and examined it more carefully. Interspersed with the coded text were drawings, maps, he realized, showing the layout of Whitmore Parish, the plantations, the roads, the waterways. Certain locations were marked with that same circular symbol he'd found carved beneath the overseer's porch. The maps showed detail that spoke of intimate knowledge, of years spent observing and recording. "They were planning this," he said quietly. "For years, they were planning this." On the final page of the journal he held, written in clear English, was a single sentence: August 11, 1840, the hymn of deliverance begins. Yesterday. The deaths had occurred yesterday, in the dark hours before dawn. "There's more," Blackwell said, his voice hollow. He had found another hiding place, this one containing a larger ledger. He opened it to reveal page after page of names, written in various hands, organized by plantation and holding. Crane recognized the format. It was a census, a meticulous accounting of every enslaved person in Whitmore Parish. 847 names. Beside each name were dates, notes, information that would take hours to decipher fully. But what caught Crane's attention was the back of the ledger, where someone had written a final accounting. Whitmore Plantation, 237 freed Thornhill, 89 freed Riverside, 63 freed Mercy's End, 112 freed, additional holdings listed, total, 847 souls delivered total, 402 oppressors judged. "Freed," Ashford repeated, his voice shaking. "They wrote, freed." A commotion from outside interrupted them. Silas Bridgewater, owner of Thornhill Plantation and one of Whitmore Parish's wealthiest residents, had arrived with a contingent of men from neighboring holdings. Crane recognized several of them: plantation owners, overseers, slave catchers, men whose livelihoods depended on the system that had been so thoroughly dismantled in this place. Bridgewater stormed into the church, his face purple with rage and fear. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Where am I? Where are the ones who did this?" "You're the law, Crane. You're supposed to find them, bring them back, make them pay for—" He stopped, his eyes falling on the dead congregation. The color drained from his face. Jesus wept. "Mr. Bridgewater," Crane began, but the man wasn't listening. "They killed everyone. Every white soul in this parish. And you're just standing here examining books?" His voice climbed toward hysteria. "There are 800 of them out there somewhere, armed probably, organized, and you're—" "They're not armed," Hawthorne interrupted quietly. "We've found no evidence of weapons taken, no ammunition missing from stores. They didn't kill these people with violence, Mr. Bridgewater." "Then how?" Bridgewater's eyes were wild. "How did 400 people die without a mark on them? How did 800 slaves vanish into nothing? You tell me that, doctor. You tell me how this is possible if not by violence." No one had an answer. Bridgewater's composure cracked further. He slumped against a pew, his expensive clothes rumpled, sweat staining his collar. "We heard it," he said softly. "At Thornhill. We heard singing the night before last. Around midnight, maybe later. A hymn, but wrong somehow. Too many voices, singing in harmonies that hurt to hear. My wife woke up screaming, and said it sounded like the dead singing. I thought it was just the field hands making noise, and sent the overseer to quiet them, but when he got to the quarters, he looked up at Crane. They were already gone. Every last one. Just gone, like they'd never existed at all. Did anyone else hear this singing? Crane asked. One of Bridgewater's men stepped forward, a lean fellow with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. I was on patrol that night, watching the river. Heard it clear as day, coming from everywhere at once. Wasn't natural singing, Marshal. Wasn't human. The silence that followed stretched until Reverend Blackwell broke it with a question that no one wanted to ask: what if it was judgment? Reverend, Ashford warned. No, hear me. Blackwell's hands gripped his Bible so hard his knuckles had gone white. What if this was divine retribution? What if God looked upon this place and found it wanting? What if? That's blasphemy, Bridgewater hissed. Is it? Blackwell's eyes blazed. 400 dead without violence. 800 vanished without trace. Singing that came from nowhere and everywhere. Tell me, gentlemen, does this sound like the work of mere men to you? No one answered, because the truth was settling over them like a funeral shroud. Whatever had happened in Whitmore Parish existed beyond the boundaries of natural law, beyond the explanations that medicine or law or even faith could comfortably provide. They had entered the territory of the impossible, and the impossible offered no mercy to those seeking rational answers. The entrance revealed itself by accident. One of Bridgewater's men, a slave catcher named Dalton who had arrived hoping to track the vanished, was searching the slave quarters at Whitmore's main plantation when the ground beneath him gave way. His startled yell brought Crane and the others running to find Dalton waist-deep in earth, his legs dangling into darkness below. There's space down here, Dalton called up, his voice echoing strangely. A tunnel or something. Help me down. They lowered a lantern first. The flickering light revealed not a natural cave but a constructed passage, its walls shored up with timber, its floor packed with earth that showed the passage of many feet. The tunnel extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness that the lantern couldn't penetrate. Crane descended first, dropping the 6 feet to the tunnel floor. The air was cooler here, carrying a smell of damp earth and something else, incense, perhaps, or burning herbs. The ceiling was just high enough for a man to walk upright, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. How far does it go? Ashford called down. I intend to find out. Send down more lanterns. Within the hour, they had assembled a party of 6 men, Crane, Judge Ashford, Dr. Hawthorne, Reverend Blackwell, Sheriff Mercer, and Dalton the tracker. Each carried a lantern and a pistol, though Crane suspected the latter would prove useless against whatever they might find below. They chose to go east first, toward the center of the plantation. The tunnel ran straight for perhaps 50 yards before branching. Crane traced the paths on a mental map and realized with growing unease that the branches corresponded to the buildings above, one passage leading toward the overseer's house, another toward the main residence, a third toward the cotton gin. They could move anywhere, Mercer whispered. Under our feet, invisible, going anywhere they pleased. The tunnels were old. Crane could see that in the worn timbers, the settled earth, the smooth floor packed by years of passage. This wasn't hastily constructed, this was infrastructure, built and maintained over what must have been decades. Every 20 yards or so, they found small alcoves carved into the walls. Some contained the remnants of candles, others held ceramic jars that still smelled faintly of oil. Lighting stations, Crane realized. A way to move through the darkness with minimal light visible from above. The walls bore markings. Sometimes they were the circular symbol Crane had found beneath the porch, but more often they were words and phrases scratched into the wood or drawn in what looked like charcoal. Most were in languages Crane didn't recognize, but occasionally English appeared. Freedom walks these paths. The patient shall inherit. Deliverance comes for the faithful. August awaits. They followed the main tunnel for what Crane estimated was a quarter-mile before reaching a larger chamber. Here the tunnel widened into a space perhaps 20 feet across, the ceiling reinforced with heavy beams. The walls were covered in symbols, overlapping layers of marking that created a dizzying visual complexity. In the center of the chamber stood something that made every man stop. It was an altar, though not like any Crane had seen in churches or native ceremonies. A flat stone, roughly circular, about 4 feet in diameter. Around its edge, iron shackles had been arranged in a pattern, 12 pairs, their chains extending inward toward the center like the spokes of a wheel. The metal showed no rust despite the dampness of the underground, instead, it gleamed dully in the lantern light as if recently polished. On the altar's surface lay items carefully arranged, bundles of dried herbs. Small cloth bags that, when opened carefully by Hawthorne, revealed powders of various colors. Carved wooden figures, crude but expressive, depicting human forms in various poses of suffering and supplication. And soil, mounds of dark earth that Hawthorne took a pinch of and examined. "This is grave dirt," he said quietly. "Earth taken from burial sites. I've seen it used in folk medicine, in various traditions." He didn't say the word both men were thinking, magic. Reverend Blackwell had moved to examine the walls more closely. His face had gone pale in the lantern light. "These markings. Some are Christian, I recognize verses from Exodus, from Revelation. But they're mixed with other things. African symbols, I think. And something older." He traced one of the larger circular symbols with a trembling finger. "This pattern appears in many traditions. The Celts called it a protection wheel. West African peoples used similar designs in spiritual practice. Even some native tribes." He turned to face the others. What if they synthesized them? Took elements from every tradition they knew and wove them together into something new? To what purpose? Ashford demanded. "To unmake their chains," Blackwell said simply. "In every way possible, physical, spiritual, supernatural. They didn't just want freedom of body. They wanted freedom of soul, and they wanted to ensure their oppressors could never follow." Dalton had been examining the floor around the altar. "There's been a fire here. Recently. See the ash?" He knelt, sifting the gray powder through his fingers. "And look at this." He held up a fragment of paper, partially burned. Crane took it carefully. The paper was of good quality, expensive, the kind used for legal documents or ledgers. On the charred fragment, he could make out partial words, inventory of property. And, valued at. "They burned their records," Crane said. "The papers that named them as property. Burned them here, in this place. They found more in the alcoves around the chamber's perimeter. Remnants of burned documents, ledgers, bills of sale, the entire paper infrastructure that had defined these people as less than human, reduced to ash and scattered in an underground temple to liberation." In one alcove, they discovered something that made Hawthorne gasp. A collection of bottles and jars, carefully stoppered, each labeled in a neat hand. He opened one, sniffed, recoiled. "What is it?" Crane asked. "Digitalis. Foxglove extract." Hawthorne's hands moved to other bottles, his face growing more astonished with each one. "Belladonna. Aconite. Devil's snare. These are all cardiac toxins, substances that affect the heart." He looked up at Crane. "But these aren't crude preparations. This is sophisticated pharmaceutical work. Someone with real knowledge created these. Could they kill?" Ashford asked. "In sufficient doses, certainly. But..." Hawthorne frowned. "These concentrations are wrong for killing. They're too dilute. In these amounts, they'd cause drowsiness, perhaps deep sleep, but not death. You'd need something else, something to..." He trailed off, his eyes falling on another collection of jars. These were labeled differently, the words written in a language none of them recognized. Hawthorne opened one and immediately staggered back, his hand covering his nose and mouth. "What in God's name?" The smell was indescribable, organic rot mixed with something chemical, something that made Crane's eyes water and his stomach lurch. He moved closer despite his body's protests and looked inside the jar. The contents were dark, viscous, moving slightly in a way that suggested decomposition. "Don't touch it," Hawthorne warned. "I don't know what that is, but it's toxic. Extremely toxic." He studied the jar from a careful distance. If someone were already sedated, already in a deep sleep, and this substance were introduced, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin, it might cause cardiac arrest. Simultaneous cardiac arrest across a large population, if administered at the same time. How would they administer it? Mercer asked. They couldn't force 400 people to. They wouldn't need to force anyone, Crane interrupted, pieces falling into place. The water supply. The food stores. Hawthorne, could these other substances, the diluted ones, be introduced slowly over time? Build up in the body? The doctor's face went white. Yes. Over months, you could introduce sublethal doses that would accumulate in the tissues. The victims wouldn't know. They'd feel perhaps more tired than usual, sleep more deeply, but nothing alarming. Then, at a predetermined time, if this other substance were released, into the air, perhaps, or into a final dose of something everyone consumed. The communion wine, Blackwell breathed. In the church. Everyone died in their pews. They all took communion. The implications crashed over them like a wave. This wasn't a spontaneous rebellion. This wasn't even a simple revolt. This was orchestration across years, careful planning by minds sophisticated enough to understand chemistry, psychology, timing. The enslaved people of Whitmore Parish had poisoned their oppressors slowly, patiently, making them vulnerable, and then, in one synchronized moment, delivered the final blow. They explored further, finding more chambers, more tunnels. The network extended beneath the entire parish, connecting every plantation, every building of significance. In the deepest chamber they found, perhaps 50 feet below the surface, they discovered the final piece. A ledger, different from the others they'd found. This one contained names, dates, and notations written in multiple hands. Crane read through it carefully, his horror mounting with each page. It was a record of meetings. Of discussions held in this underground darkness while their oppressors slept peacefully above. The entries went back 17 years, to 1823, and showed a progression from desperation to hope to careful planning. Early entries spoke of escape attempts, of punishments, of deaths. Later entries became more organized, more purposeful. The final entries, from the weeks leading up to August 11th, were chilling in their precision. August 3rd, final preparations complete. All participants confirmed. August 7th, last administration of sleep draft. All subjects showing proper response. August 9th, the calling has been prepared. The hymn learned by all. August 11th, tonight we sing. Tonight we deliver ourselves. Tonight they sleep forever, and we wake to freedom. The hymn, Ashford said. That singing Bridgewater mentioned. That was part of this. Blackwell was reading over Crane's shoulder, his breath coming fast. It's not just chemistry. Look at the language they use, the calling, deliverance, wake to freedom. They believed something more than poison would carry them through this. They believed. He swallowed hard. They believed they were enacting divine will. That God, or something older than God, was guiding them. Superstition, Dalton muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Was it? Crane set down the ledger. 847 people disappeared without a trace. 402 died at the same instant. We're standing in a tunnel network that shouldn't exist, that was built under the noses of people who owned these builders. We found evidence of planning spanning nearly 2 decades, of knowledge that shouldn't have been accessible to people denied education, of coordination that shouldn't have been possible for people kept deliberately separate. He looked at each man in turn. Tell me, gentlemen, where does the superstition end and the impossible begin? No one answered. In the silence, Crane became aware of something he'd been hearing without consciously registering, a sound like wind moving through the tunnels, except there was no wind this far underground. It rose and fell, almost rhythmic, almost like. Do you hear that? Mercer whispered. They all heard it. A sound like breathing, like distant voices, like the memory of singing carried through earth and time. It came from deeper still, from passages they hadn't yet explored, from darkness their lanterns couldn't penetrate. As one, without discussion, they turned and began walking back toward the surface, their pace quickening with each step, pursued by echoes that might have been nothing, or might have been the hymn of deliverance, still singing in the bones of the earth. Crane knew they needed witnesses, needed voices from beyond Whitmore Parish's cursed boundaries who might shed light on what had happened in those final hours. By the third day, he had organized interviews with anyone who lived within 10 miles of the parish, farmers, ferrymen, merchants, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual on the night of August 11th. The testimonies painted a picture more disturbing than silence ever could. Marcus Webb operated the ferry crossing on the Savannah River, 3 miles south of Whitmore Parish. He was a grizzled man of 50-odd years, his face weathered by sun and water, his hands rope-scarred from decades of hauling the ferry cable. He sat across from Crane in the shade of an ancient cypress, his eyes fixed on the slow-moving water as if answers might float past on the current. "I saw them," Webb said without preamble. "Around midnight, maybe half past. I was sleeping in my shack. The ferry doesn't run after dark usually, when something woke me. Not a sound, exactly. More like, the absence of sound, if that makes sense. Like the world had stopped breathing." "What did you see?" Crane prompted. "Went outside to piss, and that's when I saw the procession." Webb's voice dropped. "Coming down the river road from the north. Hundreds of them, moving in a line. No torches, no lanterns, but I could see them clear as day even though the moon was barely a sliver. Their eyes, Marshal. Their eyes were catching what little light there was and throwing it back, like animal eyes do. Like deer or possum, but these were people." "You're certain they were people?" "I'm certain they had human shape," Webb corrected carefully. "But the way they moved, it wasn't walking, not exactly. It was fluid, like water flowing over rocks. No stumbling, no hesitation, just this smooth movement all together, like they were one creature with many bodies." He rubbed his face. "I called out, asked if they needed the ferry. Nobody answered. Nobody even looked at me. They just kept moving south, toward the swamps." "How many?" Ashford asked, taking notes. "Couldn't count them all. The line just kept coming, and must have taken 20 minutes to pass. I'd say, 800. Maybe more." Webb met Crane's eyes. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking old Webb was drunk, or dreaming. But Marshal, I was sober as Sunday morning, and I ain't never had a dream that left footprints." He led them down to the riverbank, to the road that passed his ferry station. The prints were there, hundreds of them, all heading south. But they were wrong. Crane knelt to examine them more closely. The impressions were too uniform, too evenly spaced. No variation in gait, no scuffing or dragging, no sign of the natural irregularity that came from individual human movement. "Like they were marching," Mercer observed. "Military precision." "Or dancing," Blackwell said quietly. "Like they were all moving to the same rhythm, hearing the same music." They followed the prints for a quarter-mile before they vanished at the edge of the cypress swamp, where solid ground gave way to brackish water and tangled vegetation. Crane stared into that green darkness, Spanish moss hanging like funeral shrouds from the ancient trees, and felt certain that whatever the vanished had become, the swamp had swallowed them completely. The next testimony came from Sarah Hutchins, wife of a farmer whose land bordered Mercy's End plantation. She received them in her modest home, her hands never stopping their work with needle and thread, as if keeping busy might ward off the memory of what she'd witnessed. "I woke to singing," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It must have been 2 in the morning. My husband didn't hear it, he sleeps like the dead, but I've always been a light sleeper. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I realized the sound was coming from outside." "What kind of singing?" Crane asked. "A hymn. I recognized the melody, Wade in the Water, an old spiritual the slaves sing. But the words were different, and the voices." She set down her sewing, her eyes distant. "Marshal, I've heard choirs in Charleston, heard trained singers who studied in Europe. This was more beautiful and more terrible than anything human voices should create. Harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere at once, high notes that made my teeth ache, low notes I felt in my bones more than heard." "Did you see anything?" "I went to the window. Our land sits on a rise, so I can see down to where Mercy's End begins. I saw them leaving, all of them, every slave from that plantation. They were walking toward the south, and they were all singing. Men, women, children, all in perfect unison. And above them—" She hesitated, her face troubled. "This will sound mad." "Tell me anyway," Crane said gently. "Above them, the air was different. Shimmering, like heat shimmer on a summer road, except it was the middle of the night. And in that shimmer, I swear I saw shapes. Figures that weren't quite there, moving with the singing people. Tall figures, made of shadow and starlight." She picked up her sewing again, her stitches quick and nervous. "My grandmother was from Haiti, before the revolution. She told me stories about the Loa, about spirits that could be called by the faithful. I never believed those stories. But that night, I believed. Judge Ashford shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hutchins, might you have been dreaming? Perhaps you woke confused. I was awake, Judge. And I wasn't the only one who heard it. Ask anyone within 5 miles of Whitmore Parish. Ask them what they heard that night. They did ask. Over the next 2 days, Crane and his companions collected dozens of accounts, and a pattern emerged. Everyone within hearing distance of Whitmore Parish had been woken by the singing. Those closest described it as beautiful and terrifying. Those further away spoke of feeling intense dread, of wanting to flee their homes but being paralyzed by something they couldn't name. A slave catcher named Josiah Crenshaw arrived from Charleston on the 4th day, full of bluster and confidence. He brought 3 hunting dogs, renowned throughout South Carolina for their ability to track runaways across any terrain. Crane watched as Crenshaw led his animals to the empty slave quarters at Whitmore's main plantation. Piece of cake, Crenshaw declared, pulling items from the quarters to give his dogs the scent. These hounds can track a man through running water, through fire if need be. We'll have your runaways back in. The dogs began to whine. Low, distressed sounds that quickly escalated to yelps of fear. They pulled against their leads, desperate to retreat, their tails tucked between their legs. When Crenshaw tried to force them closer to the quarters, the largest hound, a massive bloodhound with a legendary tracking record, simply lay down and refused to move, trembling violently. What in hell? Crenshaw yanked the lead, but the dog wouldn't budge. He tried the other 2 with the same result. The animals would not approach the slave quarters, would not follow any trail leading from Whitmore Parish, and when Crenshaw finally dragged them by force toward the tunnel entrance they discovered, all 3 dogs simultaneously lost control of their bowels and began howling as if in mortal agony. There's something wrong with them, Crenshaw muttered, his confidence shattered. Something's poisoned them, or they smell something we can't, Hawthorne said, watching the dog's terror with clinical interest. Animals often sense things beyond human perception. Whatever happened here, whatever those people became, it left a mark these creatures recognize as dangerous. Crenshaw left within the hour, his legendary dogs useless, his reputation in tatters. That night, Crane and the other investigators made camp in what had been the overseer's house at Thornhill, one of the few structures with intact roof and walls. They sat around a fire built more for comfort than warmth, the August heat still oppressive even after sunset. None of them spoke of returning to their homes in Belmont or Charleston. Some unspoken agreement kept them here, as if leaving would be abandoning a duty they couldn't quite articulate. The silence of the parish pressed around them, broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional call of night birds. Then, around midnight, they heard it. At first, Crane thought it was wind through the pines, or perhaps water moving in the distant swamp. But as he listened more carefully, he recognized it for what it was, singing. Distant, sourceless, coming from no direction in every direction at once. The same hymn Sarah Hutchins had described, weighed in the water, but transformed into something that made his scalp prickle and his heart race. The voices were impossible. Too many, too perfectly harmonized, singing in a language that wasn't quite English and wasn't quite anything else. High notes that seemed to come from the sky itself, low notes that vibrated through the earth. And underneath it all, a rhythm like a heartbeat, like drums, like the pulse of something vast and patient finally stirring to wakefulness. Jesus Christ, Mercer whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his pistol, though what good a weapon would do against sound, Crane couldn't imagine. Reverend Blackwell had closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "It's the hymn of deliverance," he said. "The one mentioned in the ledger. They're still singing it. Wherever they are, whatever they've become, they're still singing." "That's not possible," Ashford protested, but his voice shook. "They're gone. Dead or fled or... Are they?" Blackwell opened his eyes, and in the firelight they seemed to hold a terrible understanding. "We assumed they fled. But what if they didn't? What if they're still here, just, changed? What if the hymn transformed them into something that can exist in a way we can't perceive?" The singing continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded gradually, like a tide receding. When it was gone, the silence that returned seemed even more oppressive than before, heavy with the weight of questions that had no answers. Crane stood, moved to the edge of their firelight, and stared out into the darkness that blanketed Whitmore Parish. Somewhere in that darkness, 402 bodies lay rotting in the August heat, awaiting burial. Somewhere beyond that darkness, 847 people had vanished into mystery, leaving behind only symbols, poison, tunnels, and the echo of impossible singing. "We need to expand the search," he said finally, though he had no faith that searching would yield results. "Send riders to every port on the coast, every town within 100 miles. Someone must have seen them. They couldn't just disappear." But even as he spoke, Crane knew the truth settling into his bones like winter cold. The vanished Whitmore Parish had done exactly that. They had disappeared so completely, so thoroughly, that only their absence remained, an absence that sang in the night with voices that were no longer quite human, if they had ever been human at all. Behind him, Reverend Blackwell began to pray, his words a desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, meaning on mystery, divine plan on what might have been divine retribution, or something far older and more patient than any god worshipped in Carolina churches. The fire burned low, and in the darkness, the silence waited. Dr. Hawthorne's breakthrough came on the 5th day, born from sleepless nights and an obsession that bordered on madness. Crane found him in the makeshift laboratory he'd established in Whitmore's general store, surrounded by bottles, beakers, and the bodies of 3 victims he'd been examining with increasingly desperate intensity. "I know how they did it," Hawthorne announced without preamble, his eyes red-rimmed and feverish. "Not just the how, the why, the method, the entire mechanism." He gestured to a series of glass containers lined up on the counter, each holding different substances extracted from the bodies. "I've been testing tissue samples, examining stomach contents, analyzing everything I could think of. Look here." He held up a vial containing dark liquid. "This is blood taken from Josiah Whitmore's heart. I've treated it with various reagents, and watched what happens when I add this." He dropped a single bead of clear liquid into the vial. The blood immediately changed color, turning a sickly greenish black. That reaction indicates the presence of multiple alkaloids, compounds derived from plants. Specifically, I've identified traces of foxglove, henbane, mandrake, and at least 3 other botanicals I can't name. But here's what's fascinating, none of these are in concentrations high enough to be immediately lethal. "Then how did they kill 400 people?" Ashford demanded. "They didn't. Not directly." Hawthorne moved to another set of samples. "I examined the water barrels, the grain stores, even the communion wine from the church. All of them contain traces of these same compounds. Someone had been introducing them into the food and water supply for months, maybe longer. The alkaloids accumulated in the victims' tissues gradually, making them drowsy, making them sleep more deeply, making them vulnerable." He pulled out his notes, pages covered in chemical formulas and calculations. The doses were carefully calibrated. Too much, and people would have become ill, suspicious. Too little, and the effect wouldn't have been sufficient. This required sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology, of dosing, of human physiology. He looked up at Crane. Someone among the enslaved had medical training. Real training, not folk wisdom. Perhaps they were a healer before being enslaved, or perhaps they learned through observation and experimentation over years. But the actual deaths? Crane pressed. "That's where it becomes truly remarkable, and truly horrifying." Hawthorne led them to the final body he'd been examining, a woman named Eleanor Pritchard who had been found dead in her kitchen. "I found residue on her skin, particularly around the nose and mouth. When I analyzed it." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "It's a contact poison, something that can be absorbed through the skin or inhaled. It's made from compounds I recognize, aconite, oleander, possibly some form of tree frog secretion, but combined in a way I've never seen. In a person already saturated with the sedative alkaloids, this substance would cause immediate cardiac arrest." "How was it administered?" Judge Ashford asked. "That's what kept me awake," Hawthorne admitted. "How do you simultaneously poison 400 people spread across multiple buildings, multiple locations?" Then I remembered the singing. He pulled out a charred fragment they'd recovered from the underground chamber. "This is part of a document describing something called the calling. I've been trying to decipher it, and I believe it describes an aerosol, a poison suspended in smoke or vapor. If you burned the right combination of materials, created smoke containing the contact toxin, and that smoke was carried on the wind through opened windows, through ventilation." "The hymn," Reverend Blackwell breathed. They were all singing outside, creating vibrations in the air, maybe performing some ritual, while the poison was being released. Precisely. And because the victims were already deeply sedated, already in that vulnerable state between sleep and waking, their hearts simply stopped. All at once, around 2:47 in the morning. Hawthorne sank into a chair, exhausted. It's brilliant and monstrous. It required years of planning, testing, and preparation. They turned their oppressors' own plantations into laboratories, experimented with dosages, refined their methods, all while appearing to be nothing more than obedient servants. Crane felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. You're describing a sophistication that we didn't think them capable of. Hawthorne's voice carried a bitter edge. Yes, Marshal. We assumed ignorance because we enforced ignorance. But intelligence doesn't disappear simply because you deny someone education. It finds other channels, other expressions. He gestured around the room. They learned chemistry without books, medicine without formal training, coordination without written orders. They created something we can barely understand even with all our advantages. While Hawthorne had been unraveling the medical mystery, Judge Ashford had been pursuing a different thread. He'd spent days examining the financial records of Whitmore Parish, following a hunch that had grown from peculiarities he'd noticed in the documents. Look at this, he said, spreading ledgers across the dining table in the house they'd commandeered as headquarters. 3 years ago, Josiah Whitmore ordered supplies from Charleston, fabric, tools, construction materials, valued at nearly $2,000. But there's no record of what was built with those materials. Nothing new appeared on the plantation. He pulled out more documents. Here's another. Thornhill Plantation purchased 12 barrels of lamp oil 18 months ago. But their consumption records show they only used 3 barrels. Where did the other 9 go? His finger traced lines of accounting. Over and over, I find the same pattern. Supplies ordered, money paid, goods delivered, but then they vanish. Not stolen, not accounted for in normal use, just gone. Into the tunnels, Crane said. They were stockpiling resources. More than that. Look at the quantities, the types of goods. Food that keeps, dried beans, salt pork, hardtack. Tools for digging and construction. Rope, canvas, barrels for water storage. Medical supplies. Ashford's voice grew more intense. They were preparing for a journey. A long journey, through hostile territory, requiring self-sufficiency. He produced another document, this one a shipping manifest he'd obtained from the Charleston harbor master. 3 ships departed Charleston on August 10, the day before the deaths. 2 were merchant vessels headed to northern ports. But one was a schooner called the Deliverance, registered to a free black shipping company in Boston. Its cargo manifest listed agricultural equipment and sundries bound for Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia? Mercer frowned. That's British territory. Where slavery is illegal, Blackwell added quietly. Where fugitives cannot be returned under any law. Ashford nodded. The Deliverance had a capacity of approximately 1,000 souls, Marshal. It departed Charleston fully loaded with cargo that the manifest doesn't specify in detail. It was scheduled to make a stop near the mouth of the Savannah River on the night of August 11. The implications crashed over them like a wave. Crane stood, pacing, his mind racing through the logistics. They had help. Outside help, from free blacks in the north. This wasn't just a local revolt, this was coordinated across hundreds of miles. Further than that, Ashford said, producing yet another document. I sent telegrams to contacts in other states. There have been similar incidents, smaller in scale, but following the same pattern. 6 months ago, a plantation in Georgia lost its entire enslaved population overnight. No violence, no trace. 4 months ago, the same in Alabama. 2 months ago, in Mississippi. He looked at each man in turn. Gentlemen, I believe we're seeing evidence of an organized network, something that's been operating for years, facilitating mass escapes under the cover of what appears to be supernatural intervention. But the deaths, Hawthorne protested. The 400 dead, that's not just escaping. That's execution. Is it? Reverend Blackwell had been silent, but now he spoke with quiet intensity. Or is it justice? These people were held in bondage, worked until their bodies broke, separated from their families, denied their humanity. They planned their liberation for years, built their infrastructure literally under the feet of their oppressors, and when the moment came, they ensured no one could follow. No one could bring them back. No one could make them slaves again. "You're defending mass murder," Judge Ashford said, his voice strained. "I'm describing it accurately," Blackwell corrected. "Whether it's murder or war or divine retribution depends on your perspective. The law says it's murder. Morality might say something different." He picked up the ledger they'd found in the tunnels, the one listing all 847 names. These people existed as property in the eyes of the law. Property that planned, that organized, that learned chemistry and navigation and coordination. Property that became people again through their own will and action. And in the process of reclaiming their humanity, they removed every obstacle to their freedom. Crane moved to the window, staring out at Whitmore Parish's empty streets. "We're supposed to pursue them. The law demands it. Charleston will send soldiers, federal marshals will be assigned, ships will be dispatched to Nova Scotia to demand their return." "Will they find anything?" Hawthorne asked. No. Crane's certainty was absolute. By now they're dispersed across British Canada, perhaps beyond. They had money, stolen over years from their oppressors. They had contacts. They had plans. He turned back to face the others. And they had something else. Something we saw in those tunnels, something we heard in that singing. They had faith, faith that they deserved freedom, faith that they could achieve it, faith powerful enough to organize 800 people across multiple plantations into a single coordinated action. He pulled the telegram from his pocket, the one that had summoned him here. Sheriff Mercer wrote, "all dead," but he didn't specify which all he meant. The white residents are dead, yes. But the enslaved? He shook his head. They're not dead. They're delivered. Just like they're him promised. Just like they planned for years in tunnels we never knew existed, singing songs we never really heard, becoming people we never truly saw. The room fell silent. Outside, the sun was setting on the 5th day since their arrival, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. In the growing darkness, Crane thought he could hear it again, that distant, sourceless singing, carrying across miles and through barriers between worlds, a hymn of freedom that would echo long after everyone present had turned to dust. "What do we tell Charleston?" Mercer asked finally. Crane considered the question, considered the truth, impossible, monstrous, magnificent, and considered what truth the authorities would accept. "We tell them what happened. 402 dead, cause unknown. 847 missing, whereabouts unknown. Investigation ongoing but unlikely to yield results. They'll demand more," Ashford warned. "Let them demand." Crane's voice was hard. "Let them send their soldiers and their ships and their hunting parties. They'll find what we found, empty quarters, empty tunnels, and the echo of singing that explains nothing and everything. The vanished of Whitmore Parish have passed beyond our reach, beyond our law, beyond our comprehension. They've become something we never allowed them to be, free." Dawn broke on the 7th day, and Marshal Thaddeus Crane stood at the edge of Whitmore Parish, his investigation complete yet explaining nothing that mattered. Behind him, the mass graves had been filled. 402 bodies interred in trenches dug by men from neighboring counties who performed the work with handkerchiefs tied over their faces and prayers muttered under their breath. No families had come to claim the dead. No one wanted connection to this place, to these victims who had died so peacefully yet so wrongly. The graves bore no markers, just mounds of red South Carolina clay that would settle and fade and eventually disappear, leaving no evidence that Whitmore Parish had ever held 400 souls. The parish itself was already dying. Bridgewater had announced his intention to abandon Thornhill, selling what he could and burning the rest. Other plantation owners spoke of doing the same. Who would work in these fields now? What enslaved labor could be trusted after this? The very earth felt cursed, tainted by whatever had been unleashed here, whether poison or retribution or something that transcended both. A contingent from Charleston had arrived the previous evening, military officers, federal authorities, men with hard eyes and harder questions. Crane had spent 3 hours in their presence, providing his report with clinical detachment. He showed them the tunnels, the symbols, the evidence of long planning. He presented Dr. Hawthorne's findings about the botanical poisons, Judge Ashford's documentation of the stolen resources, the testimonies from witnesses who had seen the procession heading south toward the Savannah River. Colonel Marcus Hardwick, commanding officer of the Charleston garrison, had listened with growing incredulity. "You're telling me 800 slaves simply vanished? Coordinated mass poisoning across an entire parish? Built a tunnel network without anyone noticing? Fled hundreds of miles without leaving a trail?" "That's what the evidence indicates, Colonel," Crane had replied. "Then the evidence is incomplete. Or you're incompetent." Hardwick's face had gone red. "I'm dispatching companies to search every swamp, every river, every coastal settlement. I'm sending fast ships to intercept any vessels heading north. I'm putting a price on their heads that will bring every bounty hunter from here to the Ohio River. They'll be found, Marshal. And they'll be made an example of." But Crane had simply looked at the colonel and said, "You won't find them." "Is that a statement of fact or a wish, Marshal?" Crane hadn't answered, and the silence had spoken volumes. Now, in the growing light, he watched as Hardwick's soldiers prepared to march into the cypress swamps, following the trail that Marcus Webb had reported, searching for people who had disappeared like morning mist under the sun. The soldiers looked nervous despite their weapons and their numbers. They had heard the stories. Some had been present the previous night when the singing had echoed through Whitmore Parish again, that impossible hymn that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sheriff Mercer approached, his face haggard. He had aged a decade in 7 days. "I'm resigning my post," he said without preamble. "Going back to Virginia where my sister lives. I can't stay here, Crane. I can't sleep in a place where the dead outnumber the living and the air itself feels wrong. I understand. Do you?" Mercer's laugh was bitter. "Do you understand what we witnessed here? Because I don't. I've been a lawman for 20 years, and I don't understand any of this. How they planned it, how they executed it, where they went." He paused. "What they became. What do you think they became?" Mercer looked toward the empty slave quarters, toward the tunnels sealed now by order of the Charleston authorities. "Something we can't follow. Something we can't touch. Maybe they died in those swamps and their bones will never be found. Maybe they made it to that ship and they're halfway to Canada by now. Or maybe..." He trailed off. "Maybe what? Maybe that singing we hear isn't a memory. Maybe they're still here, just existing in a way we can't perceive. Maybe they became the hymn itself, something that can't be captured or killed or enslaved ever again." Mercer shook his head. "I sound like a madman." "We all do," Crane said quietly. "That's what happens when the impossible becomes real." Dr. Hawthorne was packing his instruments, preparing to return to Belmont. He moved with mechanical precision, but Crane noticed his hands still trembled. "I'm writing a paper," the doctor said. "Documenting toxicology, the methodology. It should be preserved, studied. We need to understand how they achieved this. Will you publish it?" Hawthorne hesitated. "No. No, I don't think so. Knowledge is too dangerous. If other enslaved populations learned these methods..." He looked at Crane. "I'm a man of science, Marshal. I believe in the dissemination of knowledge, in progress through understanding. But this knowledge? This would ignite fires across the South that no amount of military force could extinguish. So I'll write it for my own understanding, and then I'll burn it. Afraid of more Whitmore parishes? Terrified of them?" Hawthorne's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because if 800 people here could plan and execute this, how many more are planning something similar right now? How many other tunnel networks exist beneath other plantations? How many other botanical laboratories are hidden in slave quarters, developing poisons while we sleep peacefully above?" He closed his medical bag with shaking hands. "We built our prosperity on human bondage, and we never considered that the enslaved might be more intelligent, more patient, more capable than we ever imagined. Whitmore Parish is a reckoning, Marshal. And I fear it's only the beginning." Reverend Blackwell had spent the morning in the church, attempting some form of spiritual cleansing that Crane suspected was doomed to failure. Now he emerged, his Bible clutched to his chest, his faith visibly shaken. "I can't consecrate this ground," he announced. "I've tried every prayer, every ritual I know, but this place refuses blessing. It's been marked by something that exists outside the Christian framework, something older, or newer, or simply other." He looked at the church where the congregation still sat dead in their pews. "They rewrote our hymns, Marshal. They took the words we used to justify their bondage, scriptures about servants obeying masters, about suffering leading to heavenly reward, and they transformed them into declarations of earthly liberation. They didn't reject our God. They remade him in their image. Is that blasphemy? Crane asked. I don't know anymore. Perhaps God is whoever has the power to enact their will. For centuries, we had that power and we shaped God to justify our actions. For one night, they had that power, and they shaped him to justify theirs. Blackwell's smile was sad. The question isn't whether what happened here was divine or demonic. The question is whether there's any difference when you're the one being judged. Judge Ashford had the most difficult task, writing the official report that would be filed with state and federal authorities. Crane found him in the study of Whitmore's main house, surrounded by paper, his pen moving across pages with grim determination. How do you document the impossible? Ashford asked without looking up. How do you write a legal record of events that violate natural law? I've drafted this report 7 times, and each version sounds more insane than the last. What will you say? The truth, but stripped of everything that can't be proven. 402 deaths from unknown causes, possibly poisoning, possibly disease, investigation inconclusive. 847 persons missing, fled or abducted, whereabouts unknown, search ongoing. Evidence of extensive underground construction, purpose unclear. Multiple witnesses report unusual phenomena, but testimony is inconsistent and unreliable. He set down his pen. I'll recommend that Whitmore Parish be evacuated and the land sold to pay debts. I'll suggest increased security measures at other plantations. I'll note that the incident appears to have been carefully planned over an extended period. And then I'll close the file, knowing we've explained nothing. Will they accept that? They'll have to. Because the alternative, admitting that enslaved people orchestrated a perfect escape, committed mass murder without leaving prosecutable evidence, and vanished into legend, that alternative undermines the entire system. Better to call it a mystery than to acknowledge what it really was, a demonstration that our control was always an illusion, maintained only by the consent of those we oppressed. And when that consent was withdrawn. He gestured at the empty parish. This is what happens. By noon, the soldiers had returned from the swamps, muddy and frustrated. They had found nothing, no bodies, no camps, no trail to follow. The cypress darkness had swallowed all evidence, and even the bloodhounds brought from Charleston refused to track, whimpering and cowering whenever they approached the areas where the vanished had supposedly passed. Colonel Hardwick stood before his assembled men, his jaw tight with anger. We'll expand the search. We'll question every free black from here to the Virginia border. We'll inspect every ship that left southern ports in the relevant time frame. You'll find nothing, Crane interrupted. They're gone, Colonel. Truly, completely gone. Accept it. I will not accept that 800. Then don't accept it. But it remains true regardless. Crane moved closer, his voice low. You want to know what I think happened? I think they planned for years, not just the escape, but what would come after. I think they had help from free blacks in the North, maybe from abolitionists, maybe from foreign powers who would love to embarrass the United States. I think they had money, resources, and intelligence we never credited them with. And I think they enacted their plan with precision we couldn't match if we tried. He paused. But more than that, I think they had something we don't understand. Something in those hymns, those symbols, that faith that sustained them through decades of bondage. Something that, when focused with enough belief and will, could achieve the impossible. You sound like you admire them, Hardwick said coldly. I'm terrified of them, Crane corrected. Because if they could do this, what else is possible? How many other impossibilities are waiting to become real? The colonel had no answer. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Crane made his final walk through Whitmore Parish. Past the empty houses where families had died in peace. Past the church where faith had been rewritten in the blood of old suffering. Past the sealed tunnel entrances that led to networks of liberation carved into darkness. Past the slave quarters that stood empty as cathedral ruins, monuments to an absence that sang louder than any presence. He stopped at the southern boundary, where Whitmore Parish ended and the wild cypress swamps began. Spanish moss hung from ancient trees like the beards of forgotten prophets. Water moved sluggishly through channels that had witnessed centuries of passage, native tribes, European explorers, enslaved Africans, and now something new, the delivered, the transformed, the vanished who were not dead but fundamentally changed. As twilight gathered, Crane heard it one final time. The singing rose from no discernible direction, carried on wind that didn't exist, sung by voices that might have been memory or might have been present in some dimension adjacent to the visible world. The hymn of deliverance, still resonating, still proclaiming freedom to anyone with ears to hear and faith to believe. Judge Ashford joined him, drawn by the sound. "Do you think they're dead, Thaddeus?" "I don't know." "Do you think they escaped to Canada?" "I don't know." "Do you think they became something else?" Crane was silent for a long moment, listening to that impossible music. "I think," he said finally, "that they became what they always should have been, free. How they achieved it, where they went, what they are now, those are questions above my authority to answer. I'm just a marshal. I deal with laws and evidence. And the evidence says that 847 people ceased to exist as slaves and 402 oppressors ceased to exist at all. Everything beyond that." He turned away from the swamp, from the singing, from the mystery that would haunt him until his own death decades later. Everything beyond that is between them and whatever power they invoked to deliver themselves. They walked back through Whitmore Parish as darkness claimed it fully. Behind them, the singing continued, growing neither louder nor softer, neither approaching nor receding, simply persisting like a truth that refused to be forgotten. The horror wasn't in the deaths. The horror wasn't in the disappearance. The horror was in the knowing, that beneath the surface of everyday life, oppression was planning its own undoing with patient precision. That the powerless were never truly powerless, only waiting for the right moment. That justice, when it came, might wear a face so strange that observers couldn't tell if they were witnessing divine intervention, human ingenuity, or something that transcended both categories entirely. Marshal Thaddeus Crane wrote his final report that night by lamplight. 402 dead. 847 missing. Case unsolved. File closed. But as he sealed the document, as he prepared to leave Whitmore Parish forever, he added one final note in his personal journal, words no official report would ever contain. They won. Not through violence or force, but through patience, intelligence, and a faith that moved beyond the boundaries of our understanding. They became free not by asking permission but by simply ceasing to be enslaved. And in their liberation, they left behind a question that will haunt this nation: if they could achieve the impossible, what other impossibilities are even now taking shape in the darkness beneath our feet? He blew out the lamp. In the darkness, the singing continued, eternal and unanswering. The vanished of Whitmore Parish had passed beyond all reckoning, beyond all pursuit, beyond all comprehension. They existed now only as absence, as mystery, as the hymn that still echoed through a cursed parish where 400 graves held bodies and 800 absences held truths that would never be spoken. And somewhere, in Canadian forests, or cypress swamps, or in a dimension of pure faith made manifest, they were free. Finally, eternally, impossibly free. If this story left you unsettled, subscribe for more horror from the shadows of American history. Comment which unexplained historical event I should cover next.